The Victorian working classes found themselves doing all sorts of physically demanding jobs to earn money for food and lodging, often labouring or hawking food and wares day after day on the cold, hard streets. Today, you will hear an account by a Victorian journalist concerned with the suffering of the working poor in 1890s London. He resolved to interview some of the capital's hard-working street traders, especially some of its more obscure vendors that battled misery and want through hard graft, innovation, and savvy business skills. You will discover one vendor that sold food unknown even to many Londoners, and the reason sales might have been limited is that what he offered stank, and find out what men selling bottled sunlight on the streets were actually doing. It sounds bizarre, and it was certainly a more unusual sight on London streets than fruit and vegetable selling costermongers, not least because what they traded was highly dangerous. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. It is the time of year when London is teeming with flowers, fruit and sunshine, and as the society and the tourist season is in full swing, a stream of small change trickles through pretty nearly every court and alley, and there is amongst the nomadic tribes who roam the streets more of happiness, and even of comfort, than might be suspected. For although the burden of life is often heavy to carry, yet is the strength, in most cases, proportionately great. Thus, what the coster would consider but half a day's work might be more than enough to crush the very life out of a clerk. But winter tells a somewhat different tale, one which is oftentimes so sombre that even the very Scrooges, however reluctantly, loosen their purse strings, and inasmuch as some good usually lurks in the worst calamity, misery and want beget those charming sisters, charity and sympathy, who, whenever nature turns unkind, are ever busy prompting us to help the destitute. Unfortunately, just as the rose tree has its aphis, that odious green fly which fattens on the flower queen's life juice, just as the rich are beset by sharks, so are the hard-up poor the prey of parasites that intercept the alms which are meant for labour in distress. Anecdotes about the ways of impostors who rob the necessitous and deserving are endless, and, in many cases, would be vastly amusing could one but forget that the rogues are virtually battening upon the lives of the famishing. The moral of which is that each one of us should, whatever else he may do, give in person, not to the casual cadger, nor to the impressive chanter, but to someone, if not more, sorely stricken fellow creature whose need is genuine. This is a heavy task, one which is, apparently, too large for most members of the moneyed classes. It is, therefore, fortunate for the half-starving that they are surrounded by the poor. I say fortunate, for, as a rule, the poor are far more generous, and, of course, much more accessible than are the well-to-do. This much upon the destitution of London's poor, because from the pictures one might otherwise conclude that the oddments of the streets passed through the winter blessed by many comforts, especially creature comforts. But it should be always borne in mind that only the upper class of the poverty-stricken indulge in those cheap luxuries which abound in humble residential districts. Take the all-ot man, cheap and wholesome as are his wares. They are far too dear for a starving man, who may need to feed a wife and family on about 6 pence a day, which, for weeks at a time, is not infrequently accomplished. Under such circumstances, to eat those flowery, buttery, hot mammoth earth apples, as the Germans call them, is a vain and ridiculous excess, much like when, during the height of the great Irish famine, an old duchess marvelled greatly why the people should starve when they could eat penny buns. A chat with the potato man elicited that his life was well mixed with beer, if not with skittles, for all of which his surplus of income over the needful to keep body and soul together was nothing to boast of. His stove and its appurtenances, although making a brave enough show when the glowing coke and flaring lamps lit up the dark, cold streets, was a most remarkable contrivance, put together on the cheap with considerable ingenuity. Most of the materials were culled from dust heaps, the rest picked up for a few coppers from the pavement dealers in old metal. A glance at the photograph will indicate how, starting with a broken-down galvanized water tank, an imposing if not particularly natty piece of apparatus has been constructed. Although the poor are ever with us, not so the baked potato. Fortunately, as my friend explained to me, in that torrid season when the balls of flour are only represented by marbles of wax, there come to him the auspicious and well-timed whelks, which enable him to tide the dead season. "Is there no other saleable vegetable that it is possible to bake?" I inquired. "I ain't heard of none," said he. "Stop, though," he continued. "I have heard tell of a chap up Old Street way as sells hot onions." This man we determined to have, the more so that he was reputed to be the only one in London of whom baked Spaniards could be bought. Though many had heard of him, none could name his pitch, and it was some little while before we could track him. Eventually, a policeman, somewhere in the Finsbury Square district, directed me to the City Road. "Where shall I find him?" I queried. "Just you go straight up. After a bit you will smell him out." Sure enough, I did, and eventually suffered in the quest much nasal discomfort, for the smell was noticeable for nearly a quarter of a mile, and at close quarters its concentrated force induced considerable aromatic pain. It is a pleasant change to turn to the little candy lads who, in American Masquerade, for a while did a good trade in some of the outlying districts of the East End. In connection with which one thing has always struck me as not quite explicable, is that however needy a neighbourhood may be, the vendors of sweets never fail to do a remunerative business. Halfpennies and farthings are, I suppose, earned in 100-odd ways by the gutter-snipes or mudlarks, and, after all, nothing goes farther, nor tastes stronger, than the sticky lumps of sugar and spice of which one may get as much as half a pound for a penny. These reckless little spendthrifts will, I fear, never hear these words. Otherwise, I should like to impart on them a few lessons upon the virtue of going without sweeties, and how much better, if a copper is earned by holding a horse, to put it into the money-box, rather than into the automatic sweet-meat slot, apropos of which I could tell them a story of real life concerning a corner boy who some 16 years ago flew to open the door of the cab from which I was about to alight. What he did with the penny I flung him, I know not, but this I do know. He is today the mayor of his native town, the civic king of over 100,000 people, despite their quaint get-up and vividly decorated boxes. The penny wonders failed to permanently catch on. Whether this was because the acute Cockney detected the spurious character of the American flag, with its curiously inadequate allowance of stars and stripes, I know not. But, anyhow, the wonders became rarities, while the barrowman, with his piles of pineapple rock and all sorts, is just as much in evidence as of yore. Pineapple rock is a traditional English sweet. Although the working classes are, at weekly intervals, very prone to journey considerable distances in order to lay out their earnings to the best advantage, their day-by-day marketing is usually accomplished not at the cheapest, but the nearest mart. It is all very well on a Saturday night to travel a mile or two, so far as the New Cut or to Middlesex Street, in order to spend part of the week's earnings upon bargains in various kinds of food, for such a trip is as much a diversion as a business, combining a species of alfresco conversazione, a club and a fair, with little or nothing to pay, and the possibility of money saved. For the other 5 days of the working week, every moment is usually precious. The whole family, maybe, is labouring from morning to night, at full pressure, with but the shortest of intervals for food and rest. Hence, the chandler's shop, just round the corner, supplies nearly all the diurnal wants. At such, pen'orths of tea and margarine, and ha'porths of milk and sugar, are procured from hour to hour. These informal words mean a pennyworth and a halfpennyworth respectively. Taking advantage of this hand-to-mouth habit, many costers pick up a very comfortable living. Of this, no better example could be cited than is depicted in the firewood hawker, who, mindful of the attraction of that all-powerful unit of weights and measures in favour with the poor, I mean the penny piece, for the last-named trifling sum supplies the large basket of firewood depicted. Such a calling is much less precarious than might be imagined, for in a round, which may take a week to cover, there are many regulars who never fail to buy their pen'orth. Closely connected with the coster is a man who, I fear me, must make morning hideous, as also midday, afternoon, and evening, by yelling out, "Pen! Pain!" He would have made a most excellent railway porter, for one could not even faintly guess what he meant. Here let me stop to record that my observation of the coster fraternity impresses on me that distinct and attractive bawling is, as though as yet untaught, a most valuable art, one which every street huckster should be master of, although hardly any know even its rudiments. Pen, pain, stands for a pen'orth of paraffin oil, or bottled sunlight, as I like to think of it, which recalls George Stephenson's poser, put to Dr. Buckland in the early days of the locomotive. Stephenson was the first to build a steam locomotive to carry passengers on a public railway. "What," said he, "is the power that is driving yonder train?" No answer was forthcoming, so Stephenson explained, in one word, sunshine, which is, to be sure, the literal truth, coal being nothing but latent radiance derived from the sun, stored up heat caught by the feathery fronds of acrogenous fern trees, which waved their plumes in tropical climes, and which have since been squeezed by ocean's mighty hydraulic press into that carboniferous rock that, known as coal, provides the power to whirl us along at 50 miles or more per hour. What is true of coal is not less so respecting the oil shales, whence the so-called mineral oils are derived. But the itinerant vendor of paraffin is far too practical to bother his head with the thought that, long before the age of stone, in days when grapevines might have grown where is now the iceberg North Pole, Britain was little more than a subtropical swamp, and the cold steppes of Russia, whence a large portion of the oil is derived, was much the same. Rather is the oil-hawker troubled by what he, no doubt, thinks are vexatious and superfluous regulations respecting flashing points and the storage of large quantities of oil, which the London authorities insist upon being observed. And quite right, too, for the poor, as a rule, have a very small regard for risk to life, more particularly when their own lives are in question, of which the newspapers give unceasing reminders. Nor are the poets silent, as witness the following parody on one of the nursery classics. Mary had a little lamp, all full of kerosene. Mary put some on the fire. She has not since benzine. A talk with the oil-saturated coster informed me that no serious capital outlay was demanded in order to go into the business. Nothing needed to be paid for but a tap, a measure, and a funnel. How about the oil and the barrow? It's this here way, sir. If you're a straight 'un, you can do like me. First, you borrows a barrer on the strength of your honesty. Then you goes to the oil dealer and gets tick on the strength of your barrer. To buy on tick means to pay for it later. At first sight, the transaction seems what financiers might term shaky, but after all, the risks run by the oil dealer and the barrow lender are much less than are constantly being faced by large mercantile houses, connected with the wholesale trades of London. It is always to be remembered that, just like the well-to-do, so has the rough-built man in corduroys got a reputation, a past, a future, and an identity, and, moreover, he has his own circle of acquaintances, who, poor though they may be, can, if he deserve it, give him a good name. Many are apt to forget that a man of honour may be even as Lazarus.